She was humiliated from the moment she set foot in the camp just for wearing a technician's uniform without insignia, without rank, and without a family name anyone cared to respect. "You here to fix the B-2 exhaust pipe or train on invisible vacuum cleaners?" The laugh echoed through the training hall. A general's son spilled hot coffee on her chest and smirked. "Guess you're used to the smell of machine oil." "Huh?" In class, they disabled her simulator screen, forcing her to sit and watch while others flew. No one imagined the woman they mocked with a mechanic girl sticker would be the only one willing to step into the cockpit when the real B-2 failed. In the hush that followed that mockery, Zoe Lane simply dabbed at the dark stains spreading across her uniform's front and stood a little straighter. Her posture had that quiet air of someone who'd seen worse than petty insults, a subtle drawing back of her shoulders, a deep calm in her gaze. Nearby, the arrogant trainee who had flung the coffee watched her for signs of tears or anger, but Zoe refused to give him any reaction. Instead, she let the coffee drip down onto the concrete floor, ignoring the sting of it seeping through fabric onto her skin. The training hall was otherwise hushed, an underground dome of reinforced steel hidden beneath desert sands. The artificial lighting cast harsh circles on the ground, reflecting off the metallic frames of stealth simulators and leaving the corners in half shadow. A few other trainees moved aside, exchanging smirks, some openly, others more discreetly, as though uncertain whether to join in the blatant hostility or simply watch. Zoe's uniform might have resembled a standard flight jumpsuit, but it bore no patches or name tags, nothing to signal that she deserved any real seat in these advanced stealth pilot classes. And so they had labeled her a ground tech intern from the start, telling her that her rightful place was wiping grease from landing gear or running vacuum checks on electronic compartments. Yet her acceptance letter, a single typed page with an anonymous signature, had promised something more: that she would be allowed to sit in on the training sessions, perhaps even get simulator time. She had come trusting that promise, but so far it had amounted to ridicule and locked controls. No one had actually taught her anything about flying, and she began to suspect they never would. She first arrived at Black Talon Training Base after a midnight ride in a windowless transport van. Security protocols demanded no one see the approach from above. She recalled the dryness in her throat when the vehicle had descended a hidden ramp, the dim glow of overhead sensors flickering across thick steel doors. The entire facility was carved into the earth like some clandestine fortress, the hush so absolute it swallowed footsteps. She'd heard rumors about Black Talon for years that it admitted only the scions of powerful families, those with generational ties to the highest echelons of the Air Force or defense contracting. One rumor said a pilot here once broke all altitude records for a stealth test only to vanish under a hush of secrecy. Another whispered that the founding general had carried out the first flights of the F-117 in pitch darkness with no ground lights just to prove the stealth capabilities. Zoe listened to all these tales with quiet interest, a flicker in her eyes suggesting she had her own secrets. Yet no one in the base's corridors noticed that flicker. They saw only a young woman wearing battered cargo pants, an old pilot jacket with no insignia, her hair in a neat low braid that did nothing to hide the scuffs on her boots, a nobody among legends. She recalled the intake briefing on her first morning. A colonel with graying hair had scanned her meager file, paused, and frowned. "Says here you're an intern, Ms. Lane. No rank, no formal flight school background, no references. We only admitted you because of some letter from..." "Well, never mind. You do realize this place is for advanced stealth aviators, yes? Not typical ground mechanics." She had given a short nod, meeting his gaze. "I understand, sir," was all she said. The colonel's frown deepened. "The best you can hope for is to watch, maybe help maintain simulator equipment. We don't train grease monkeys to pilot B-2 spirits. If that's your dream, you're in the wrong desert." She offered no argument, just a calm, "I see." That first day had set the tone. They would keep her at the periphery, ignoring her presence. But that alone wouldn't have been so bad if it weren't for the culture of sneering contempt from the other trainees, each certain of their birthright. Being told to fetch cables to wipe sim cockpit canopies, these slights only grew more blatant with each passing hour. That morning, she endured the coffee spill from the general's son, a loud, brash figure named Reed Hawkins, famed for his father's combat medals. He loomed over her, telling her in front of a half-circle of watchers that she smelled like stale engine fluid. Zoe accepted it with a stony face, internally cursing the man's cruelty, but refusing to stoop to a confrontation that might get her kicked out. She told herself she'd find a moment someday to prove she was more than they assumed if the base gave her even the slightest chance. But the chance never came. The next day, the instructors assigned her to a corner observer desk in the main simulator bay, turning off her screens so she couldn't participate. One pilot, an heiress to a major defense tech empire, even swiveled around at her station and said, "We're training for Mach 0.9 stealth approach, honey. Not your high school RC planes. Just watch and learn if you can." The group around her chuckled, tapping complex readouts on their flight dashboards, ignoring Zoe entirely. She simply studied the simulator modules from a distance, memorizing every flicker of data on the overhead monitors, silently absorbing knowledge no one bothered to teach her. They had no idea she recognized every control interface from old blueprint images she'd studied as a teen. No idea she'd grown up around men who tested stealth bombers, but that was her secret and she guarded it well. Their cruelty culminated at the flight patch ceremony 3 days later. The trainees were all called to an assembly hall, a large echo-prone space with concrete floors and walls decorated with flight squadron emblems from past stealth programs. Zoe tried to remain at the back of the crowd, but an instructor singled her out, beckoning her forward. She stepped up uncertainly, noticing the broad smirks on the other trainees' faces. On stage, the lead instructor, a stern woman with a row of ribbons across her chest, declared that each pilot in training would receive a patch signifying their progress. Some were singled out for advanced fighter tactics, some for the drone stealth unit. The rest received a standard stealth cadet patch, a symbol of being part of the B-2 track. Then the instructor turned to Zoe. "And for our resident ground tech, or whatever she is, we have something special." The hall erupted in laughter as the general's son, Reed, stepped forward holding a cheap sticker. In bold letters it said, "Mechanic Girl." He slapped it on Zoe's shoulder, pressing it down with mocking emphasis. "We gotta label the help right," he said, provoking further guffaws. Zoe stood there, heart pounding, her hands clenched at her sides, but her face remained impassive. The applause that followed was scornful, a cacophony of sneers. Someone took out a device and filmed her capturing her silent humiliation. Then as the clapping died down, the instructor said with false sympathy, "Now, Ms. Lane, you can hold your head high knowing you're recognized for your role in the hangar, cleaning up after real pilots." The ceremony ended, leaving Zoe singled out, a figure of ridicule pinned with a meaningless sticker. She walked off stage, eyes fixed ahead, refusing to let them see any flicker of tears or rage. That night she found no solace in her assigned bunk. Instead, she left drifting through corridors lit by neon strips until she reached a deserted corner near the B-2 maintenance bay. There, through a reinforced window, she could see the silhouettes of actual stealth bombers, black angular forms shaped like wings of shadow. Each B-2 sat in a separate climate-controlled hangar, gleaming an eerie glow under overhead lamps. She stared at the closest one for a long time, letting herself recall a memory of her father. His large, calloused hands placing hers over a blueprint for an early stealth wing design. "Feel the lines, Zoe," he'd said in that memory. "This is more than an airplane. It's a symphony of angles and edges quiet as nightfall. If you respect it, it'll carry you through any storm." The recollection brought a slight tremble to her lips. She inhaled, pushed the memory aside. Then turning, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass. This small, unassuming figure in a worn uniform, a cheap sticker on her shoulder, mocking her. She shook her head, peeled the sticker off, and tucked it into her pocket. An ache flickered behind her eyes. For a moment, she let herself feel that loneliness in her chest, the weight of her father's absence. He had been the one to survive a near-catastrophic B-2 test run in 1994 or so, the rumor said, but the cost had been enormous. She sighed, exhaling regret that he'd never lived to see her follow in his footsteps. Then she turned away from the window, determined to endure another day in this place that so eagerly crushed her spirit. She had come too far to quit. The base routine ground on. She found herself relegated to menial tasks, cleaning simulator pods, carrying toolboxes for instructors. The other trainees treated her as subhuman, awarding her no courtesy. She overheard snide remarks in the cafeteria line in the corridors. She's never even seen a stealth cockpit in flight, let alone touched a B-2 control. Bet she doesn't know the difference between a stealth angle and a cargo hold. I can't believe they let someone with no rank roam free. And so on. She responded to each sneer with silence, focusing on memorizing the base layout, the intricacies of the stealth aircraft she glimpsed in passing. Some nights she slipped into the flight archives, scanning old documents about B-2 engine upgrades, or she watched the simulator sessions from behind a tinted glass partition, noting every procedure, every checklist. She had no illusions that the instructors would eventually let her train. She would teach herself if she had to. Because deep in her heart she believed her father's legacy had paved a path. If only the base gave her one opening, she would be ready. That opening arrived in the form of an emergency no one foresaw. Late in the week, the base was shrouded in darkness from a power glitch that forced them to rely on backup generators. The entire stealth training schedule had been postponed until dawn. In the gloom of near midnight, a frantic alarm blared, echoing through the subterranean corridors. Zoe jolted awake in her bunk, the metallic wail twisting her insides with apprehension. She hurried to the main hangar, following the swirl of red emergency lights. When she arrived, she found chaos. A cluster of uniformed officers stood near a B-2 prototype, whispering urgent words into malfunctioning comms. Sparks occasionally flickered from an open panel on the aircraft's underside, casting sporadic bursts of light. A staffer was shouting, "The autopilot is stuck in override weapons protocol is reading engaged, and we can't re-establish ground control." Another staffer shook his head, rattled. "All external attempts to power it down have failed. We can't risk sending anyone inside. The system might jettison or worse." The phrase "or worse" hung in the air, conjuring images of a stealth bomber's sophisticated bombs or missiles accidentally coming online. Zoe stood at the periphery, scanning their frantic faces. She watched the general's son, Reed, who was usually so brash, now pale and silent, stepping back from the aircraft as if it might explode. Another pilot shook her head, declaring, "I'm not climbing in there. That's a ticking time bomb." The instructors looked at each other, all apparently too wary of risking their own necks. One older colonel barked, "We need a volunteer with the nerve to go in, but no one's authorized to handle a meltdown in a B-2 spirit, not even me." He cast a desperate glance around the circle, but everyone avoided his eyes. The sense of dread was thick. This was a new experimental B-2 variant with advanced electronics that had apparently glitched catastrophically. A single wrong move might trigger the weapons or fry the pilot inside. The overhead alarm continued its shriek, accompanied by strobing red lights. In that strobing gloom, Zoe felt something stir within her, a memory of her father telling her about the B-2's hidden override systems, how early-phase engineers designed a fail-safe sequence that only a few individuals had ever used. He had said it was top secret, locked behind layers of classified test data. She stared at the bomber's silhouette, that angular shape that had once been the hallmark of her father's near-fatal test flight. And she felt an inexplicable pull, as though all her father's knowledge and her unspoken heritage converged at this moment. No one else dared move. She waited, one beat, two, then stepped forward, slipping through the ring of stunned personnel. At first they didn't even notice her. Then Reed saw her from the corner of his eye and hissed, "What are you doing, grease monkey? Get back!" She ignored him, approaching the B-2's lowered entry ladder. The colonel turned and barked, "Stop, that cockpit is locked. You'll be toast if you try to force your way in." But Zoe continued, her hands trembling slightly, yet resolute. She saw the flight suit on a bench nearby, an older model pilot suit that presumably was for test runs. She grabbed it, zipped it up over her uniform, then reached for the emergency oxygen pack. The colonel repeated, "Do not do this. The system is compromised. You'll kill us all if you push the wrong button." She met his gaze with a calm she didn't entirely feel and said, "Someone has to. Let me try." Perhaps it was the certainty in her voice or the desperation of the situation, but the colonel didn't forcibly stop her. She climbed the ladder, the red emergency lights painting her silhouette in ghostly shades. The small crowd fell into hush, everyone bracing for an explosion or meltdown. Inside the cockpit, the acrid smell of burnt circuitry assaulted her nose. The canopy had partial power flickering screens and a low hum of dangerously unstable energy. She slid into the pilot's seat, heart pounding in her ears, and strapped in. Her father's voice from so many years ago guided her fingers. B-2 override is a 5-step sequence. Press the secondary bus control, purge the auto-run, bypass the circuit with a coded input, then power the manual flight helm. She whispered those steps under her breath, ignoring the urgent blinking of weapon system engaged. The panels hissed with static, and the console lights warred for dominance. She systematically tapped commands into a hidden interface, one she recognized from old design documents. Each step triggered a beep or a spark, but she pressed on, sweat trickling along her temples. Outside, she knew the entire base was watching the screens in mission control, possibly seeing her attempts to wrestle control from the glitch. After a minute, the B-2's overhead console stabilized the weapons alarm, turning from red to amber. Another minute, and the autopilot override cleared. She exhaled in relief, but a new alarm wailed the engine spool was engaged. The bomber was about to power its engines in idle. She needed to do an emergency flight check or risk an unplanned thruster meltdown. Her training had been non-existent in this official capacity, but she relied on her father's teachings, half-remembered schematics, and instincts from all those blueprint analyses she'd done in secret. Her hands moved quickly over the controls, activating manual flight mode. The system recognized her input as an authorized user because, ironically, her father's old test pilot codes had never been fully scrubbed from the B-2's master lineage. A hush settled in her mind as she realized how improbable this was. She was half-literate in a code designed decades ago, and yet it was answering. She flicked the engines to a partial warm-up, ignoring the frantic voices from the comm channel that flared back to life. "Unknown occupant, identify yourself," someone demanded. She recognized the colonel's voice. She pressed the transmit button and said simply, "Zoe Lane taking control." Then she cut off the external feed, focusing on the meltdown. She recognized she had no time to fully shut it down from inside. The system required a stable flight approach. Once engaged, the B-2 might attempt to taxi or even take off autonomously if she didn't guide it. So she made a snap decision: fly it out of the hangar circle, the desert skies, and land it properly, resetting the entire system to a safe state. It was madness. She had no official flight hours in a B-2, but her father's ghost seemed to hover over her shoulder, whispering confidence. Somehow she guided the B-2's stealthy frame from the hangar. Sirens blared as the massive doors parted. Onlookers scrambled away from the taxi path. She advanced the throttle, each muscle in her arms tense, guiding the bomber out of the subterranean ramp onto a dedicated runway that extended beyond a disguised desert exit. The base's watchtowers must have been going crazy, but she had no time to dwell on their alarms. She flicked on the instruments for night flight, scanning the minimal readouts that still flickered from the meltdown. The B-2 lurched forward, exhaling a roar from its stealth engine. She accelerated, feeling the drag and the desert wind. The runway's end rushed toward her in the faint moonlight. She prayed her father's instructions would hold. With a steady pull on the yoke, the massive black wings lifted, carrying her into the star-strewn sky. She soared away, the desert shrinking below, silent as a phantom. Inside the cockpit, the warnings receded one by one, replaced by a smooth hum of flight. For a long moment, she just breathed, letting the surreal facts settle in. She was piloting a B-2 Spirit in pitch-black night alone. In the Mission Control Center, an uproar raged. The colonel demanded to know who the hell Zoe was and how she got those codes. The instructors were half panicked, half mesmerized by the swirling radar blip. Reed Hawkins stared at the monitors, his jaw slack. "She's insane," he muttered. Others whispered in shock. "She's actually flying it in stealth mode." The base generals, alerted by the meltdown alarm, arrived to see this improbable real-time flight path. Then the B-2 began a careful arc overhead. The watchers glimpsed it as a black silhouette crossing the moon. Inside, Zoe toggled the system from meltdown to manual override, resetting circuit after circuit, each responding to her commands like a well-trained beast. She recalled her father's instructions about how to handle an emergent glitch: stabilize, confirm pitch, confirm altitude, then address the weapons system. She did all that, gradually disarming the last bits of erroneous weapon commands. The plane responded, its engine no longer threatening to spool out of control. After about half an hour of circling above the base's perimeter, Zoe prepared for a return approach. She radioed into Mission Control, her voice cracking with adrenaline. "I've stabilized the meltdown. Disarming final subroutines. Request clearance to land." A stunned voice answered, yes, clearance granted." Then the colonel's voice cut in. "Who are you, Lane? How did you—" She flicked the comm off again, focusing on the descent. The runway lights glowed in the distance, the only bright points in an otherwise black desert. She guided the B-2 gently downward, fighting her shaking nerves. The landing gear extended with a metallic sigh, the crosswinds buffeting the massive wings. At last the wheels touched tarmac, the plane rolling to a stop in a swirl of dust. She cut the engines, feeling the hum fade into the hush of midnight. A wave of utter relief swept her. She had done it. A small army of base personnel raced out to surround the bomber. Zoe opened the cockpit, letting in the cool desert air. She unlatched her harness, the entire moment surreal. Then stepping onto the B-2's fold-down ladder, she climbed down her boots, hitting the tarmac with a final thud. Floodlights snapped on, blinding her momentarily. As her vision cleared, she saw the colonel and a group of instructors approaching at a brisk pace. At their head was an old man with 4 stars on his uniform, General Tyrell, rumored to be one of the base's founding aces. He advanced with trembling hands. She noticed tears glistening in the corners of his eyes. Everyone else hung back, breath caught in their throats. The general halted a few steps away, studying Zoe as though she were a living ghost. Then, to everyone's shock, he lifted his right hand in a slow, deliberate salute. The old soldier's voice quavered as he said, "Zoe Lane, the daughter of Captain Elijah Lane." Zoe felt her own breath hitch. The hush was so profound she could hear her own heartbeat. The general exhaled. "Your father was the original B-2 test squadron leader. He survived the failed 1994 live run that almost destroyed him, and he alone had the knowledge of that override sequence. Or so we thought." He swallowed. "No one else was ever given that data, not even me. But apparently your father entrusted it to you, and you just saved this entire base." The crowd from Reed to the instructors who had belittled her gazed in stunned awe. Some physically wavered as though they might kneel. The colonel, blinking rapidly, stepped forward. "You're telling me that Ms. Lane is the direct heir to Elijah Lane's B-2 knowledge. But we treated her like a ground tech." His voice trailed off, tinged with shame. In the back, the instructor who had forced the humiliating sticker on Zoe now looked ready to vanish. Zoe remained silent, her breathing unsteady. She had never intended for her identity to come out like this. She had come to this base to see if her father's quiet dream of inclusive flight training, where ability meant more than connections, could exist. But she had found only arrogance. Now that secret was laid bare under the glare of floodlights. General Tyrell lowered his salute, stepping closer. He lifted one hand, seeming to want to clasp Zoe's shoulder, but he hesitated. "Child," he said softly, "your father was the bravest man I ever knew. If he entrusted you with the B-2's hidden codes, then you carry not just his knowledge, but his spirit." A tear slipped down the old man's cheek. "We owe you our lives tonight." In a long moment of absolute stillness, no one dared speak. Then the general faced the assembled trainees and staff, clearing his throat with renewed authority. "Everyone who mocked this young woman," he growled, "everyone who refused to let her near a simulator, who forced a worthless sticker on her lineup by the hangar. Now, if you have an ounce of respect left in your bones." His voice cracked like a whip, echoing across the desert night. People jumped to obey. Even Reed, his face drained of color, scrambled to stand in formation outside the hangar. The rest followed suit, forming a disorganized line. Some wore expressions of regret, others of raw fear. Zoe watched, an odd sense of detachment settling over her. She realized she didn't crave their apologies or their groveling, but she wouldn't turn away from this. The general said quietly, "Ms. Lane, if you'd like, you can come with me to my office. We'll talk about your rightful place in this program, maybe even a rank." A hush followed. Zoe considered it, gazing at the row of stooped figures who had tormented her. Then she gave a faint shake of her head. "I need to finish something first," she murmured. She walked past the general, heading to the lineup. They stood rigidly, eyes downcast. She approached them, her boots scraping the tarmac that had moments ago been the B-2's runway. No one made a sound as she halted in front of them. A few parted their lips, maybe to stammer apologies, but she offered them no chance. She walked the line, her gaze brushing each face in turn. The instructor who had pinned the sticker on her. The general's son who had spilled coffee, the arrogant scions who had laughed at her. Her silence was absolute, a condemnation sharper than any words. When she reached the end near Reed, she heard him whisper, "I'm sorry." But she didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she turned to face them all. The old memory of her father's voice guided her once more. Sometimes we must speak to remind them of the sky's real meaning. So she spoke softly but clearly enough for all to hear. The sky doesn't care whether your hands wear silk gloves or oil stains. It only opens for those who have the courage to fly into fear and not turn away. That was all she said. The wind carried her words across the hush, and she turned her back on them, walking away from the line. No one dared move until she disappeared into the shadows near the hangar's edge. In the immediate aftermath, the base staff offered her a hero's welcome. The commanding officers begged her to accept an official rank to lead specialized training to become a figurehead for Black Talon's next wave of stealth pilots. But Zoe politely declined. She had seen too much arrogance here, too many barriers that wouldn't be dismantled by mere words. She felt no need to remain in a place that had only recognized her worth when faced with crisis. So she gathered her meager belongings, her battered jacket, her single duffel bag, and prepared to depart. A few officials tried to dissuade her, promising immediate promotions, a brand new flight suit, a personal squadron. She quietly shook her head, saying only, "I'm not seeking rank or glory. My father taught me that flight is personal, not a pedestal." She intended to vanish just as she'd come, with no fuss, no ceremony. The night after the meltdown, she slipped away before dawn, leaving behind a scrawled note for the general. "I appreciated the chance to see Black Talon with my own eyes. May you shape it into a place of true courage, not empty pride." When the base awoke, she was gone. Word spread quickly that Zoe Lane had left, ignoring all attempts to give her official pilot status. The general, grim-faced, ordered the staff to strike her name from the standard rosters to preserve her privacy. But he also demanded that certain changes be made at once: a thorough review of admission policies, new guidelines for simulator access, and a purge of the hazing culture that had thrived for too long. Meanwhile, the base quietly renamed itself Quinn Strategic Center in honor of an old vow the general had made with Zoe's father. No public announcements explained the rename, just a simple directive from the top. Trainees who once walked with swagger now found themselves reminded daily of the meltdown fiasco, of how they'd refused to step up while the mechanic girl had soared. The hush that settled over the campus was laced with reflection, perhaps even guilt. Some cadets like Reed withdrew from the program altogether. Others stayed determined to improve, to atone. The entire place felt the absence of Zoe, who had come and gone like a midnight wind, leaving echoes of her father's unstoppable spirit. Weeks later, the official record of her presence vanished from the base archives, replaced by a single classified footnote stating an unknown pilot had recovered a B-2 meltdown. But rumors endured. The story passed among the new generation of cadets, whispered at bunk lights out, told in corners of the mess hall that a young woman in an old pilot jacket once appeared, mocked by everyone, then flew the B-2 Spirit when all others cowered. Some said she had been an angel of stealth, a ghost figure, or a rumored phantom pilot from old times. Others claimed she was the last direct link to the program's founder. The base's leadership said little, letting rumor swirl. But at night, when the desert wind whipped across the runways and lightning flickered in the distant mountains, cadets would stare at the sky, imagining they saw a lone silhouette overhead, like a giant black wing cutting the clouds. And they'd remember that the ability to fly, truly fly, cannot be inherited by mere name or rank. It must be earned through fearless dedication, the kind Zoe Lane had shown. Some nights, an older instructor who had once ridiculed Zoe caught himself searching the star-scattered horizon, half hoping she might return. He never dared voice this aloud, but he felt a pang of longing for a second chance to treat her right, to ask about her father, to learn from her knowledge. That pang lingered, a mark of quiet regret. Others kept the small mechanic girl sticker pinned to a notice board in the instructor's lounge, a token of their shameful past. If visitors asked what it meant, they'd hear a half-mumbled explanation, a reminder that we never again judge a pilot by appearance. Over time, the entire base culture began shifting. The new recruits, no longer forced to prove their lineage, came from broader backgrounds. The flight training sessions introduced a new lesson plan about humility, with a footnote referencing the meltdown incident. The command staff might have wanted to bury that night, but the general insisted they keep it as an internal lesson, so no one would forget how a single overshadowed individual saved them all. Meanwhile, Zoe traveled on, unburdened by titles or location. She had no interest in fame or recognition. Some said she joined a remote test airfield in the Rockies, others that she took to traveling under an assumed name, flying cargo planes in distant war zones to deliver humanitarian aid. A rumor circulated that she was spotted in a top-secret flight facility on the East Coast consulting on new stealth prototypes, only to vanish again before they could hold her for a press interview. Every rumor lacked confirmation. She left no trace, except for an occasional fleeting mention from technicians who swore they recognized her old jacket, her quiet manner. It was as though she had become a living extension of the B-2's stealth, passing unseen through the skies. And that was how she wanted it. She had proven her father's legacy and found her own path in the air, unbound by any chain of arrogance. The knowledge she carried was for her alone a personal testament to the bond she shared with that legendary plane, forging a future that might or might not intersect with the world's spotlight. At Black Talon, now Quinn Strategic Center, the memory of Zoe Lane endured in intangible ways. The bunk once assigned to her remained empty, no new occupant named, as if to keep an unspoken shrine for the silent pilot who outflew them all in a single night. The runway where she landed the B-2 was rumored to be haunted by her footsteps, though no one truly believed in ghosts. Instead, they believed in caution, in humility, in readiness. The new cohorts heard the cautionary tale: never underestimate the quiet ones who labor among us. They might know more about flight than we can imagine. And so the base, once a citadel of conceit, softened around the edges. Instructors scolded anyone who mocked a cadet's family background or uniform. Each simulator seat was made accessible to all, even the novices, because the brass realized that true skill could come from unexpected corners. As the months rolled on, the success rate of the base's stealth flight programs rose. Pilots emerged better trained, less reliant on their last names, more reliant on their internal discipline. The old guard, including some scions of generals, grudgingly admitted that the new system produced stronger aviators. A few of them credited the mechanic girl for sparking the change. Others stubbornly refused to talk about it, nursing wounded pride. But the results were evident. A new generation of stealth flyers grew up with a story of humility guiding them. The desert nights remained the same, though. The wind still howled across the dunes, lightning still split the horizon on stormy evenings, and the base still thrived beneath the sand. Yet every so often when thunder rumbled, a cadet would recall the myth of Zoe Lane, how she rose from the ashes of scorn to rescue a B-2 from meltdown. In those stories, she was either a hero or a ghost, depending on who told it. But always, she was remembered for the unwavering calm that carried her into the cockpit that no one else dared enter. No official plaque bore her name. No monument stood at the runway's edge. Even the records of her father's 1994 flight remained mostly sealed. But she had changed the base more deeply than any statue or record could capture. Hers was a legacy etched in living memory, a single flight that turned the arrogance of Black Talon on its head. The general, for his part, quietly championed new scholarship slots for outsider talents, people who might have come from mechanic families or had skill sets overshadowed by the big names. He wanted to honor Zoe's example so that the next mechanic girl who appeared at the gates wouldn't be sneered at but recognized for potential. Over time, that policy seeded a slow but sure transformation in the pilot ranks. Meanwhile, the world outside remained largely ignorant of what had transpired in that secret base. Only a few in the stealth aviation community whispered about an unknown pilot who reactivated a B-2 override sequence. Conspiracy forums occasionally flared with speculation about Elijah Lane's daughter, but no conclusive evidence surfaced, and the chatter died down, overshadowed by the next wave of rumors about cutting-edge drones or next-gen fighters. Life at the base continued. If Zoe ever returned, she did so unseen, traveling in hush, perhaps checking on the progress from the shadows. The changes had become too big to hide. Everyone accepted that humility was the new currency at Quinn's Strategic Center, and that the old elitist ways had died the night Zoe soared. Some nights, the desert wind carried what sounded like echoes of a stealth bomber overhead, yet no official flight plan was logged. A few older instructors sitting outside the hangar smoking in the moonlight would exchange glances. Wonder if it might be Zoe flying some test craft borrowed from a hidden inventory. They'd grin at the idea, but they'd keep it to themselves, because in a place that prized secrecy, letting the myth flourish was often more powerful than any confirmed sighting. So, they let the students dream. They let them believe that out there, a pilot with no rank and no name soared freely, reminding them that skill and courage matter infinitely more than pedigree. As for those who had mocked her so viciously, some tried to bury the memory, focusing on new tasks, forging new alliances. Others apologized in private letters, left with the general or the instructors, hoping one day she might read them. They never knew if she did. The memory of their jibes of the coffee spilled, the humiliating sticker haunted them. Perhaps that shame pushed them to become better humans, more aware. Perhaps it drove them out of the program. Either way, the tension they once brought had dissipated. The base was calmer, more purposeful. It was as though Zoe's flight had exorcised a ghost from the corridors. In time, the base thrived under its new name, producing excellent stealth pilots who truly earned their wings. And in that success, one might find Zoe's quiet satisfaction from afar, her father's proud smile hovering in intangible presence. The night storm still swept the desert, thrashing the dunes, streaking lightning across the black sky. During those storms, the cadets who had learned of Zoe's story would step to the windows or the edges of the runways, peering out into the swirling darkness. They would watch for a silhouette, a B-2-shaped shadow, imagining her high above them, prowling the thunderheads. They might stand there for minutes or hours, with hearts pounding, hoping for a sign of her existence. Usually they saw nothing but lightning and shifting clouds. Yet the hope alone spurred them to train harder the next morning, to push the simulators to new limits, to refine every stealth maneuver. Because they wanted to be worthy of that intangible presence, worthy of a sky that belongs to the fearless. And that was perhaps Zoe's true gift to them, an unspoken challenge to meet the standard she'd set, not by birthright, but by unshakable resolve. The general occasionally meditated on these developments, replaying that night in his mind, remembering the moment he saluted Elijah Lane's daughter under the blazing floodlights. He never forgot the trembling in his own hands, fear, awe, and regret for not recognizing her earlier. She had forced them to confront how complacent and arrogant they'd become. He took to writing a personal journal, each entry reflecting on humility and transformation. He recorded how ironically it took an outsider scorned by the system to save them from a meltdown of their prized bomber. He ended one entry with a line, "Sometimes the truest pilot is the one with no rank at all." He never showed those pages to anyone, but perhaps he hoped that if Zoe ever wandered back, she might see how her father's old friend had tried to honor her legacy. Time wore on. The next cohort of recruits arrived, wide-eyed, hearing cryptic references to some legendary meltdown and the pilot who'd soared into the night. The instructors, now reformed, taught them that skill is never guaranteed by bloodline, that no pilot should mock another for their background. And the recruits for the most part believed. The synergy in classes improved, forging bonds that once never existed. And so ironically, Black Talon, once a fortress of elitist inheritance, became a place where novices, even from modest families, might flourish. The old reputations were overshadowed by a new era, and in that new era, Zoe Lane's name was unspoken yet always present. Her father's legacy had found completion in her flight, bridging the gap between arrogance and true grit. On an especially stormy night, a female cadet with no famous parentage strolled the perimeter of the base, recalling a rumor that Zoe might have been a distant cousin of some revered pilot. She stared at the flickering horizon, saw lightning reflect off a passing shape overhead, though it could have been a cloud. She felt a shiver, imagining that maybe it was Zoe free in the sky, or perhaps just the memory of her drifting in the desert wind. In that moment, the cadet felt her heart surge with inspiration, determined to show that real flight skill was about knowledge, discipline, and the kind of courage Zoe embodied. She returned to the dorms, flicked on a reading lamp, and studied B-2 schematics late into the night. She was but one of many who, thanks to Zoe's example, believed they too could master the invisible wings if only they fought for it. And so in an unspoken quiet, Zoe's legacy took root. She was gone, but her father's dream and her fearless act shaped every rivet and corridor of the newly named Quinn Strategic Center. Officers no longer asked about a candidate's ancestry. They studied skill. They valued humility. The meltdown fiasco was recorded in secret logs described as Event 7 Delta, with minimal details. B-2 prototype override engaged by unknown occupant forced safe landing. Investigators concluded that the occupant's identity was to remain classified. Officially, no one outside the base needed to know. Unofficially, everyone who'd been there that night whispered the truth among themselves, forging a vow to never treat a newcomer with scorn again. In a place once defined by closed doors, that vow was a radical shift in culture. And in that shift lay Zoe Lane's greatest triumph. Thus the name Zoe Lane vanished from rosters, from daily logs. She walked away without farewell, leaving behind only the memory of her unspoken vow to fly in the spirit of her father, to carry the knowledge he'd entrusted to her, and to remain unbroken by petty scorn. The base carried on, forging new stealth pilots, each hearing the cautionary tale of how a quiet mechanic girl bested them all. Meanwhile, in the desert nights, lightning still cracked the sky, and the wind roared across the dunes as if searching for the missing piece of the legend. Some said the wind was calling her name, beckoning her back to the place she had saved. But for now, at least she stayed away, leaving them to reflect on what it meant to truly earn the sky. Because the sky, after all, cares nothing for one's uniform or lineage. It welcomes only the soul brave enough to command it with unwavering grace. If this story gave you chills like it, share it, leave a comment. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for stories that remind us courage is quiet and legacy doesn't always wear a uniform.